Paul Fletcher's final act wasn't a confession. It was a code. Richard Doyle's red umbrella was more than a weather shield. It was a signal that controlled the flow of millions worth of heroin through Liverpool's busiest port. And somewhere in the shadows, an unseen mastermind known only as the Architect pulled the strings of a criminal empire so vast it had turned the city into a narco highway running hidden in plain sight. It began with the death of a man no one had any reason to fear. Paul Fletcher was the kind of person people barely noticed. A quiet, middle-aged accountant who lived alone in a modest flat above a hardware store in Toxteth. He paid his bills on time, rarely took holidays, and spent his evenings reading or walking his dog. So when his landlord found him slumped in his armchair, an empty bottle of sleeping pills on the floor, there was little surprise. The coroner's report was routine: suicide, likely caused by stress or depression. But what came next changed everything. Among the usual paperwork and bills scattered on his desk was a sealed envelope addressed to whom it may concern. Inside was a handwritten note, one that didn't read like a farewell. There were no apologies, no mentions of loved ones. Instead, it contained a list of numbers, company names, and what appeared to be foreign bank accounts. Scribbled in the margins were phrases like, "Too big to report, more than tax, and they'll come for me." It was cryptic but enough to raise suspicion. The police handed it over to a financial crimes unit, assuming it might lead to a tax evasion case or money laundering scheme. They were half right. When investigators accessed Fletcher's computer, they found a single spreadsheet titled Charity Donations, Q4. The file looked harmless at first glance, full of ordinary transaction data and charity references. But when a digital forensics analyst decrypted a hidden tab, the tone changed. The numbers were massive. Millions of pounds flowing between shell companies, some registered to businesses that no longer existed or had never existed at all. Others were labeled only with vague references like Shipment 3A or Delivery Route. The money trail was elaborate, but consistent. Transfers moved in circular patterns, through fake charities, logistics firms, and offshore banks in Cyprus, Luxembourg, and Dubai. Every company was registered just below the regulatory threshold that would trigger audits. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to keep it invisible. Fletcher hadn't just stumbled onto financial irregularities. He'd uncovered the financial backbone of a criminal network. At first, investigators thought this was a lone operation, perhaps a clever money laundering ring hidden under the cover of overseas donations. But a deeper dive revealed the transactions were tied to freight movements through the Port of Liverpool, specific shipments, specific times, and specific handlers. This wasn't just fraud, this was logistics, military precision logistics. And if Fletcher's records were correct, drugs were being moved in and out of the country under the radar for years. The realization came slowly, and with it, unease. This wasn't something a local gang had cobbled together. This was infrastructure, the kind that only came with time, discipline, and leadership. Fletcher hadn't taken his own life because of guilt or despair. He'd realized something too late. He had found the engine behind a drug empire, and someone had made sure that engine kept running without him. The spreadsheet found on Paul Fletcher's computer became the key to unlocking something far more sinister than financial misconduct. At first, investigators believed they were looking at a clever case of charity fraud. The document was filled with entries labeled as donations, some as low as £2,000, others nearing £100,000, all routed through different organizations that claimed to provide humanitarian aid. But the names didn't check out. One charity, supposedly feeding children in Eastern Europe, was registered to an empty office above a betting shop. Another listed its headquarters at a garage that hadn't been operational in years. When forensic accountants followed the money trail, they discovered that these donations didn't stop at the charities. They were routed onward, sometimes within hours, to a network of obscure shipping companies. These firms, on paper, were international logistics providers. In reality, they were shells. Their websites were basic, with vague mission statements and stock photos. Their listed phone numbers rang through to disconnected lines or answered by voice messages with heavy distortion. Most had been incorporated recently, often under foreign nationals whose identities couldn't be verified. The deeper investigators looked, the more patterns emerged. The dates on the donations matched shipping manifests filed at the Port of Liverpool. These were routine imports, nothing suspicious at face value. Fruit shipments from Spain, electronics from the Netherlands, machinery from Belgium. But one detail stood out. The same 3 freight companies were involved in every suspicious entry. That coincidence triggered a broader audit. A single container flagged for secondary inspection revealed a small but critical anomaly, a hollowed-out space behind a panel in the wall. Inside was 12 kilograms of high-grade heroin, tightly vacuum-sealed and masked by industrial lubricant. Customs officers began quietly scanning every container linked to those companies. The results were shocking. In less than a month, they uncovered over 3 million pounds worth of heroin, hidden in shipments labeled as children's clothing, medical aid and construction materials. It was methodical. Whoever ran this had ensured the paperwork matched, the tariffs were paid, and the container seals appeared untouched. Even the drug packaging was professional, sealed to avoid detection by sniffer dogs and carefully packed to avoid damage during transport. Paul Fletcher hadn't just documented these transactions, he had categorized them. Notes in the margins referred to volume control, cycle times and handler rotation. Investigators realized they were reading an internal operating manual. Each donation corresponded to a shipment, and each shipment was tracked against a code. Even the drop-off points were listed, usually warehouses just outside the city, all leased by shell firms under false identities. This wasn't a side business for a group of criminals. This was a streamlined operation with its own accounting system, supply chain, and management structure. The heroin wasn't just arriving in Liverpool, it was moving through it like clockwork. The charities were camouflage, the companies were props, and the city's port was the gateway. All of it had been hidden in plain sight, right there in the books, and for years no one had noticed, until now. The Port of Liverpool had long been a symbol of trade and industry, a historic gateway where cargo moved in and out of the city day and night. It bustled with activity, containers lifted by towering cranes, forklifts buzzing across vast yards, customs officers inspecting shipments. But beneath that appearance of order and routine, a hidden current had been flowing for years. The port was being used to smuggle heroin into the UK, not in hidden compartments inside fishing boats or under car tires, but right through legal declared cargo. The first clue came from reviewing historical shipping records. Investigators isolated containers connected to the companies named in Paul Fletcher's files. Each one entered the port on a predictable schedule, every second Tuesday like clockwork. The routes were always the same, starting from ports in Antwerp, Marseille, and Rotterdam. The customs paperwork was perfectly in order. There were no red flags, no inconsistent weights, and no missing documentation. But a disturbing pattern began to emerge when the names of dock workers handling these containers were cross-referenced. Certain employees only appeared in relation to these flagged shipments. They rotated positions, sometimes working cranes, sometimes on inventory, sometimes assisting customs. None had criminal records. They had clean backgrounds, steady employment histories, and in some cases, even commendations. But one quiet anomaly caught a detective's attention: the consistent presence of a man nicknamed Eddie Gloves. Security footage confirmed it. Each time a suspicious container arrived, Eddie was there. Always wearing a pair of red safety gloves, always stationed near the unloading zone. When viewed in isolation, it looked like routine port work. But when footage from multiple dates was analyzed side by side, the same silent action repeated. Eddie raised one hand, adjusted his gloves, and nodded to a crane operator nearby. The gesture was subtle, almost unnoticeable, but always occurred moments before a container bypassed secondary inspection and was loaded directly onto a waiting truck. Investigators began tracking those trucks. The companies listed on the vehicle documentation didn't exist. The vehicles had legal plates, but the addresses linked to their registration were vacant or recently demolished. Drivers wore uniforms and carried digital delivery manifests. Everything about the process was designed to appear official, but the cargo inside was never delivered to any customer. Instead, the trucks vanished into industrial estates and re-emerged hours later empty. The heroin was being smuggled with surgical precision. A single wave from Eddie gloves could mean hundreds of thousands of pounds worth of narcotics passed into the city without a trace. The workers weren't smuggling in darkness or secrecy. They were hiding in efficiency. No rushed jobs, no frantic movements, just seamless operations that mimicked the daily routine of a functioning port. The realization was chilling. Liverpool's port wasn't just being exploited, it had been infiltrated. Every layer of the operation, from customs paperwork to vehicle routing, had been rehearsed and refined. The people involved didn't need to run or hide. They simply blended in, hiding heroin shipments in the smooth hum of normal business. As investigators dug deeper into the supply chain, they began focusing on the vehicles collecting the containers. At first glance, the operation appeared seamless. Trucks arrived with proper manifests, drivers wore official uniforms, and no one ever questioned the routine. But something didn't sit right. The companies supposedly operating the fleet were impossible to reach. Websites listed contact forms, but no phone numbers. When police tried to visit the registered addresses, they found overgrown lots, burned-out buildings, or parking spaces under flyovers. These firms, though polished on paper, did not exist in reality. A breakthrough came when an unmarked surveillance drone followed one truck to a luxury car dealership on the edge of the city. It seemed out of place, a glass-fronted showroom displaying Range Rovers, BMWs, and top-end Audis. There was no sign of active business. The doors remained locked, the lights dimmed, and yet every few days another high-end car would be delivered or driven away. When investigators ran the plates of the vehicles stored there, what they found was startling. Many were registered to people who didn't exist. One Bentley belonged to a man listed as living at a council flat that had burned down 4 years earlier. A black Range Rover was registered under the name of a woman who had died in. These vehicles weren't being sold, they were being used as part of an elaborate laundering scheme. Further inspection of vehicle registration databases revealed a growing fleet of luxury cars, all tied back to shell companies. Some were registered to fake leasing firms. Others were held in the names of fictitious directors. These cars weren't moving drugs, but they were absorbing the profits. In many cases, the vehicles were auctioned through closed bids, where buyers paid inflated prices. The cash would then be washed through international payments and land back in donation accounts under the same fake charities Fletcher had recorded. It was clever, almost artistic. The money from the heroin sales didn't just disappear, it morphed into physical assets, then re-entered the system as legitimate revenue from car sales. The people behind it didn't flaunt their wealth. They invested in things that wouldn't attract suspicion. Showrooms in quiet corners of the city. Import businesses tied to obsolete parts. Leases held by the dead. Every step of the operation had been built with care and foresight. The trucks, the containers, the paperwork. It all flowed together. But it wasn't until they uncovered the ghost fleet of luxury cars that investigators truly understood the scale. This wasn't just drug trafficking, it was a machine, and every part of it was running silently in plain sight. The surveillance footage from the port provided hours of mundane activity, containers being lifted, dock workers shuffling through their shifts, cranes moving cargo with mechanical precision. But one figure stood out, not because of what he did, but because of what he didn't do. He didn't lift anything, sign paperwork, or speak to others. He simply walked a loop near certain shipments, always alone, always at the same time, and always holding a red umbrella even when there wasn't a cloud in the sky. Surveillance teams began tracking Doyle outside the port. He lived in a nondescript flat in the Baltic Triangle, an area popular with young professionals and startups. His building had no security cameras, and his comings and goings were erratic. For days he didn't leave at all. When he did, it was usually to walk the waterfront, or buy groceries. Always alone, always quiet. That investigators knew better than to mistake stillness for innocence. They obtained a warrant to search his flat. It was immaculate, with minimal furnishings, and no signs of chaos. But behind a wardrobe panel in the bedroom, they found a hidden compartment. Inside was a burner phone, a stack of receipts, and a hard drive wrapped in a sealed plastic bag. The hard drive contained what would become one of the most detailed operational records ever uncovered in a British drug investigation. The files were encrypted, but once cracked, they revealed a ledger that mirrored and in some cases extended what Paul Fletcher had documented. Doyle hadn't just kept financial records. He had recorded logistics, employee aliases, delivery routes, and even efficiency ratings. Each shipment was labeled with a unique code, followed by notes on time of arrival, delay risks, and payment confirmations. One entry simply read, "Grace Container 17 passed to Eddie, 6-min delay, no question." It was all there. The timing of port activity, the names of dock workers in rotation, license plates of unmarked trucks, GPS data on delivery points, and financial links to Shell charities. Doyle wasn't an outsider, he was a planner. Possibly the planner. His role wasn't to carry or sell drugs, it was to ensure the entire system functioned without interruption. The red umbrella had been a signal, a visual marker for when to proceed, when to hold. It was simple, effective, and almost invisible. No radio chatter, no phone calls, just a color that moved across the port like a silent command. And while Doyle's actions had been precise, methodical, and invisible for years, the ledger proved something undeniable. He wasn't just an observer, he was an architect. One name kept surfacing throughout the ledger, found in Richard Doyle's hidden compartment: Grace Relief Foundation. It appeared in dozens of entries, sometimes abbreviated as GRF. Other times, into its official filings, Grace Relief Foundation had been operating for nearly 8 years, claiming to provide humanitarian aid, mostly food, clothing, and medical supplies to orphanages in Romania, Moldova, and occasionally parts of North Africa. It posted photos on social media of young children receiving parcels of goods. The captions were heartfelt, the mission statements polished, and the financial disclosures modest. On paper, it appeared clean, too clean. The charity's registered office address led to a row of rundown commercial units in North Liverpool. The specific suite number, listed, no longer existed. A faded sign for a defunct locksmith business still hung by the door. There was no sign of aid workers, no distribution hub, not even a donation bin. Curious, investigators ran the names of the charity's directors. 3 of them were registered under foreign passports, Albanian and Moldovan nationals who had entered the UK on student visas and disappeared shortly after. The 4th director had died 3 years earlier, though no amendment had ever been made to the charity's records. That discovery prompted a deeper inspection of the charity's actual aid activity. Customs data showed that containers marked for Grace Relief had passed through the Port of Liverpool dozens of times, usually labeled as humanitarian cargo, rice, powdered milk, medical equipment. Yet none of the recipient organizations overseas could be confirmed. Phone numbers led to voicemails. Emails bounced back. In some cases, the orphanages listed in the manifests had been shut down years before. One of the seized containers, originally marked for Grace Relief, was brought in for full inspection. It was supposed to hold medical supplies, gauze, disinfectants, gloves. The boxes were there, neatly packed and labeled, but when they were cut open, each one had a false bottom. Beneath the layer of legitimate goods were tightly wrapped packages of heroin, vacuum-sealed and chemically treated to avoid detection. The drugs were camouflaged behind charity, hidden inside hope. The cruelty of it was not lost on the investigators. The operation had exploited the goodwill of donors and the blind trust of customs officers. Each donation was just a layer of paint over something poisonous. Even the Foundation's website, still live at the time of investigation, encouraged monthly giving with the tagline, "Be the reason a child sleeps full tonight." The level of manipulation was staggering. Grace Relief wasn't just a cover, it was the centerpiece of the disguise. Every shipment that bore its name passed through customs with little resistance. It was the kind of protection that money alone couldn't buy, protection built on reputation and emotional appeal. But now that protection was starting to unravel, Paul Fletcher's role in the heroin pipeline wasn't always clear. For weeks, investigators had assumed he was just another cog, perhaps a reluctant accountant who had helped cook the books and eventually cracked under the pressure. But as more of his records came to light, a different picture emerged. Fletcher hadn't started as a participant. He had stumbled into the operation completely by accident. And once he understood what he'd found, it was already too late. Years earlier, Fletcher had been working as a freelance financial consultant, taking on short-term contracts with small businesses across Liverpool. One such client was a struggling logistics firm that claimed to be reorganizing its finances. The job was routine, cleaning up old accounts, preparing books for an upcoming audit. But as Fletcher began sorting through the records, he noticed unusual patterns. Repeated payments to charities with no clear purpose, large cash withdrawals that didn't match any declared expenses, and internal memos referencing shipments with vague labels like sensitive cargo or non-standard. Curious, he started digging deeper. He wasn't a forensic accountant or an investigator, just someone with a talent for spotting inconsistencies. And what he found scared him. The logistics company wasn't really in the business of moving goods, it was moving money. Worse, the financial activity tied directly into international transfers that matched known smuggling routes flagged in public customs alerts. Fletcher had uncovered the financial skeleton of something criminal, something organized and deeply embedded. At first, he did nothing. He saved copies of the files and backed them up on encrypted drives. He didn't call the police. He didn't tell anyone. But over time, he began to realize that he wasn't just looking at the past. He was watching the operation evolve in real time. New shell companies popped up. New donations appeared in the books. More shipments passed through the port. The scale was growing. So Fletcher did what he thought was smart. He built a fail-safe. Quietly, he began compiling a digital file. A dossier with account numbers, shipping data, registered vehicle details, and all the anomalies he could find. His plan was simple. If anything ever happened to him, the file would automatically be sent to several law enforcement agencies across the UK and Europe. It was a last resort, an insurance policy, in case the wrong people found out what he knew. But something went wrong. After his death, investigators tried to access his automated email system. It had been disabled. His encrypted backup drives had been accessed remotely 2 weeks before his death. The files had been altered, and key sections were missing. Someone knew what he was doing. Someone had silenced him before the full truth could surface. What was once assumed to be a suicide driven by guilt now looked more like the final act of someone who had been cornered. Fletcher hadn't chosen to be part of the operation. He had tried to expose it, but he had waited too long, underestimated how far the reach extended, and paid the price for discovering the wrong secret at the wrong time. The deeper detectives delved into the network, the more they realized this was no ordinary drug operation. Every layer peeled back revealed new complexity, new players working behind the scenes. It became clear that the heroin pipeline wasn't just controlled by local criminals or small gangs. It was run by a shadowy figure whose identity remained unknown, someone operating with vast influence and ruthless precision. This mysterious leader wasn't listed on any company documents or public records. He didn't appear in police files, nor did he leave digital footprints in the usual places. Instead, he existed like a ghost, communicating through intermediaries and encrypted channels. Whenever a suspicious transaction or shipment was flagged, it was quickly rerouted or cancelled. This invisible hand controlled the entire supply chain, from the port workers and fake charities to the luxury car dealerships laundering the money. The prime suspect in the case, Richard Doyle, the man with the red umbrella, had appeared to be the mastermind. But as investigators studied Doyle's files and movements, a different picture emerged. Doyle was skilled and meticulous, but he was following orders. His ledger contained frequent notes referencing a codename, the Architect. Whenever Doyle mentioned the Architect, it was in the context of approvals, strategic changes, or warnings about increased surveillance. Tracking the communications tied to the Architect proved nearly impossible. The team uncovered layers of digital obfuscation, VPNs, burner phones, and servers scattered across continents. Attempts to infiltrate this network led to dead ends and false leads. It was as if the Architect was always one step ahead, watching, adapting, and controlling without ever being seen. Meanwhile, financial investigators uncovered transactions that suggested the Architect was laundering money through legitimate international businesses, import-export companies, real estate firms, and investment trusts. These businesses had plausible front operations, employing staff, filing taxes, and appearing legitimate on paper. But their true function was to mask the flow of drug money, spreading it across borders and industries. The scale of this operation was staggering. It was no longer just about heroin moving through Liverpool's port. It was about power and control, with a network so vast it could influence businesses, local officials, and even parts of law enforcement. The Architect had built a fortress of silence and deception, one that extended far beyond the city limits. This revelation changed everything. The investigation was no longer just about catching a few smugglers or dismantling a local pipeline. It was about confronting a shadow empire, hidden in plain sight but pulsing with deadly efficiency. And the detectives knew one thing for certain: whoever the Architect was, they were still out there watching, waiting, and ready to strike if threatened. The true battle was only just beginning. As the investigation grew, so did the stakes. Police knew that taking down the network meant more than arresting a handful of low-level operatives. It meant exposing a hidden empire that had woven itself into Liverpool's economic and social fabric. The deeper detectives went, the more they realized how deeply the criminal organization had embedded itself, and how many innocent people were unknowingly caught in its web. To build a case strong enough to reach the Architect, law enforcement had to move carefully. They set up surveillance on key figures like Richard Doyle and the network of shell companies controlling the trucks and warehouses. But with every step forward, there were setbacks. Phone lines would go silent, offices would be abruptly vacated, and digital trails erased. It was as if the network anticipated every move. In one instance, officers raided a warehouse believed to be a major storage site for shipments. The location was empty, except for a few pallets of cardboard boxes. Surveillance footage later revealed that hours before the raid, the contents had been moved out through a hidden exit, a narrow loading bay masked by shipping containers. The sheer coordination suggested insider knowledge and advanced warning. The investigators were dealing with a network that had eyes everywhere. Amid this, the human toll became apparent. Families living near the industrial estates noticed increased traffic of unmarked vehicles and strangers. Community workers reported spikes in overdoses linked to the influx of heroin flooding local streets. While the masterminds moved money and managed shipments with cold precision, the drugs were destroying lives on the ground. The contradiction was stark. Behind the polished ledgers and corporate fronts lay chaos and suffering. At the same time, whispers of corruption began to surface. A few officers who had shown interest in the case reportedly faced subtle warnings, and some evidence mysteriously disappeared. Detectives grew wary, realizing they couldn't trust everyone within their own ranks. The possibility of leaks raised the threat level. This was no longer just a fight against traffickers, but against an entire system willing to protect itself. Faced with such challenges, the investigative team doubled down on their approach. They collaborated with national agencies and international partners to trace financial flows and intercept communications. Undercover agents infiltrated some of the fake charities and freight companies. Slowly, fragments of the operations hierarchy began to emerge. The breakthrough came when a mid-level courier, arrested on unrelated charges, agreed to cooperate. She provided details about meetings, payment schedules, and